On today's Versus episode, we put the Tyranids from Warhammer 40k against Halo's Flood. Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Versus episode. And no, you guys did not misread the title or mishear the introduction. We are finally doing it today. The Tyranids from Warhammer versus the Flood. This has been a request that I've gotten pretty much every day since I've started doing Versus videos. So if you like today's content, make sure to leave a comment and a thumbs up down below. I'm trying something a little bit different today. I want this to be a comprehensive matchup. So not only are we going to look at which one of these factions would win in a head-to-head matchup, I'm also going to be considering them in 3 different circumstances. Which one is deadlier as a new infection on a single planet, which one is a deadlier invasion force for a high-tech universe, and which one is deadlier for a mid-power universe like Halo or Star Wars. Before we get to all of that though, we need to take some time to profile these 2 species. We'll start first with the Tyranids. The Tyranids are extragalactic spacefaring aliens or Xenos from the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Very much like the Flood, they have a central hive mind and exist basically solely to consume. Legends say the Tyranids were born in the space between galaxies, and by the time they've reached the Milky Way, they've also supposedly already consumed entire galaxies whole, explaining their almost unending numbers. Most of the Tyranids we know aren't actually purely biological, but rather a biomechanical hybrid, with each ship or creature designed for a very specific purpose. Tyranids travel the universe in hive fleets, unstoppable collections of Tyranid ships. Hive ships are not only a means for travel, but also reproduction, with new Tyranids being grown within the hearts of the massive vessels themselves. The species is probably most well known for its unstoppable quantity and its ability to wholly consume worlds. And Tyranids aren't interested in planets for colonization or for strategic purposes, rather only for obtaining new organic material. When a hive fleet comes across a new world, their first step is usually to quickly rain down spores from space. Now, these spores or pods typically contain a variety of Tyranids, the smallest of which infiltrate every bit of the planet, from rocks and oceans to plants and animals. The organic material is prepared for collection, and sometimes new Tyranids already start growing on the planet's surface. By this point, even the atmosphere will show early signs of corruption, which not only makes the eventual main Tyranid invasion easier, but also causes mass fear among the planet's inhabitants. Assuming the planet is actually populated, at this point the main assault would occur. Beasts and creatures varying greatly in size land on a planet from the hive ships and work to destroy all resistance so organic collection can be done in peace. Biomass is collected into capillary towers which start snaking their way through the planet's crust and also into the atmosphere. By this point, the Tyranids have the world in their grasp. The capillary towers fully root themselves and integrate into the planet, not only collecting more biomass, but also pumping out reinforcement troops. With resistance now finally eliminated, all collected matter is then sent up to the hive fleet, which then continues on to the next planet. This whole process has the effect of not only feeding the race, but also improving them. Upon the consumption of a civilization or sapient population, the Tyranids will gain access to their skills and memories. Useful information will be translated into, for example, a new, more effective Tyranid form, or a type of form that will complement the other Tyranid soldiers. Other hive ships and beings, as I mentioned, will also be created, of course, out of any accumulated biomatter. However, when facing a particularly well-defended world, the Tyranids can make use of several advanced techniques to help them gain a foothold before the initial invasion. Often they will attempt to infiltrate species through deception, getting into the population and weakening them from the inside before the arrival of the fleet. Gene stealers literally work their way into organic beings and populations, while other creatures like lictors are specifically bred for stealth. Through the Tyranids' special evolutionary abilities, basically anything is possible, and they are extremely adaptable. The hive fleets themselves also create a psychic bubble when invading a planet. This not only disrupts warp travel and communication throughout a solar system, but also causes fear and panic in local populations, something that is built upon by ground-based forces. Speaking of the warp, it is worth noting that Tyranids don't actually use the warp for faster than light travel. follow. They instead use a ship called a narwhal. We don't know exactly how quickly the Tyranids can travel using a narwhal. Things in 40k tend to take an extremely long time, but again, the species are apparently intergalactic in nature. Regarding individual troops within the Tyranids, there are way too many varieties for me to actually look at in any sort of depth. Again, the Tyranids are masters of evolution and genetic manipulation. Creatures are created for any type of situation imaginable and are typically a mixture of biological and mechanical matter. Most prefer to use weapons like knives, teeth, claws, or spines, all of course grown from their body, but some form of Tyranids also use ranged weapons or even psychic powers. Tyranids also use psychic powers to communicate with their hive mind. Although Tyranid fleets do appear to work mostly independently, they do also serve one greater consciousness. Within a single hive fleet, individual beings operate according to basic biological instincts unless given direct orders from the hive mind. Often the hive mind will operate specifically through advanced beasts like hive tyrants or Tyranid warriors, and synaptic creatures allow the communication of orders through hive beings, allowing totally coordinated local actions. However, the key aspect of the Tyranids, and the one thing I haven't talked about yet, is their sheer numbers. A single hive fleet is almost an unstoppable force, and new fleets are being discovered all the time. The Tyranids have likely consumed several galaxies worth of material. These sheer numbers combined with the visceral variety of a Tyranid horde, I think makes the fate of the Milky Way galaxy fairly obvious. Next up, we have the Halo universe and the Flood. I actually had a really in-depth discussion of the Flood just a couple of days ago in a previous video. I think I covered most of the important points pretty well, so I'm going to be a little bit lazy and just use that for this video. If you've already seen that video, which is about whether a single flood spore could destroy the Earth, I'll put a timestamp on the screen. Go there and you can get on to the actual matchup. Everyone else, let us learn about the Flood. The Flood are parasitic life forms whose sole goal is to consume all matter within the universe. They are extremely relentless, very powerful, and one of the toughest enemies in science fiction. What makes them so tough though, you might be wondering? Well, they spread extremely quickly. Once an infection starts, it's extraordinarily hard to stop through conventional means, and the Flood becomes more intelligent as more members and more biomass is added to its group consciousness. The infestation is sort of like an exponential slippery slope where things get far more dangerous as the Flood further propagates. Let's talk about the species on a physical level though. The most basic non-cellular type of Flood, and the one that will be starring in this video, is the Flood infection form. Infection forms are really the Flood's movers and shakers. They're typically the ones who start off any large-scale infestation. They target organic and typically large sentient beings, killing them and using barbs and stalks to take over their nervous systems, basically turning their victim into a zombie. Infected hosts will then be transformed by the Flood virus, taking a variety of forms, the most common of which is likely the combat form. This makes the host extremely strong, durable, and gives them incredible regenerative properties. The lore I think is a little unclear on this, but it appears that combat forms can then go on to infect other organic beings, further propagating the Flood. Some beings will also be transformed into carrier forms, which, as the name would suggest, focus on infection rather than combat. Initial transformed Flood appear as mindless zombies. However, the Flood grows further intelligent through the consumption of matter. When an individual's body is taken over by the Flood, their mind is also given to the shared consciousness, which gains not only their knowledge, but also their memories. Thus, the larger the infection, the more effective the Flood become as a whole. They can use strategy on a grand level, and even individual infection forms seem to become more intelligent. As the Flood grow, typically mindless, low-level Flood forms will start collecting biomass in a single spot in order to form a central intelligence. The degree and seriousness of a Flood infection can actually be measured by the sophistication of these intelligences, which seems to be directly correlated to the amount of sentient beings which have been consumed. On a low level, you have a proto-gravemind, which is composed of perhaps a few dozen organic beings. Proto-graveminds will control troops on a local level, they'll start infusing some actual tactics and strategy into the actions of the Flood, and it also allows individual forms to do things like operate vehicles or machinery. On a much larger level, you have something like a keymind, which basically represents a planet's worth of organics in a single Flood form. Keyminds were intelligent and tactical enough to rival even the most advanced Forerunner AI, so when a Flood infection gets to that level, it's certainly no laughing matter. Because of everything I've just mentioned, you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that defeating the Flood is very very, very difficult. You can kill an individual form by destroying the nervous system, often the head, but the infection won't truly be defeated until every form and every spore has been destroyed. This can be done, of course, through brute force, but the much more effective way is to starve the flood of their food, removing organics. Alright, with that out of the way, I'd like to look at the several questions that I posed at the beginning of the video. But I think before doing that, it might be helpful to make some general observations about the two species and how they work together. The Tyranids as a faction have several main advantages over the Flood. I think their combat forms are much deadlier. Even Flood pure forms I don't think can compete. The fact that they're also geared towards basically any situation due to their numbers and their ability to control their own biological evolution is another huge advantage. The Flood, on the other hand, are literally parasitic. They rely on organic matter to grow at all. What's more, the Flood rely on sentient organic matter. It hugely benefits them, but if they reach a planet with no living sentient beings, they're in big trouble. The Tyranid, on the other hand, can consume basically any biological matter, whether plants or anything. However, the Flood's parasitic nature is also their greatest strength. As a Flood infection grows larger, it gets exponentially more dangerous. Not only are the Flood able to reproduce more quickly with more organics, but the more beings they consume, the more intelligent they become overall. With the formation of grave mines and key mines, the Flood become almost incomprehensibly sophisticated. In my mind then, the Flood have actually a higher ceiling, more potential overall than the Tyranids. When looking at overall size of the two factions, we run into some difficulty. The Flood never really have a stated size. I mean, depending on the history, during the Forerunner War, obviously there were many Flood, but I don't think they ever came close to rivaling the size of the Tyranid faction. With that being said, let's put the Flood and the Tyranids head to head, and I think literally the only question that we need to ask here is whether the Flood are advanced enough to actually consume and transform the Tyranids, and vice versa. And people might not like the answer, but I actually think that they are. The Flood were the creations of the Precursor, an incomprehensibly advanced alien race. Or arguably, I guess you could say that they are the Precursors, but that's a discussion for a different day. The important bit is that their biology is so complicated and so advanced that even the Forerunners were unable to develop a cure for the Flood. The Tyranids also have a focus on numbers. I believe that this actually works against them in this situation. As we saw with the Forerunners, unwieldy and large empires are basically prime targets for a Flood attack. But it all comes down to that initial question: which one of the factions will consume the other one? I believe the Flood, especially in its pure form, is the more virulent of the two and is the one that will win. I also think the Flood do have an advantage if there's a small infection on a single planet, but that's just due to their parasitic nature. I also think they have an advantage in a universe of an extreme tech level. Although I think that point is arguable, the Tyranids also make use of memory and skills adapted from consumed populations, and their sheer numbers offer an advantage that the Flood wouldn't have, at least at the beginning of an infection. Looking at a mid-level universe like Halo or Star Wars, I give the advantage back to the Tyranids, again because of their sheer numbers. Again, being parasitic, the Flood are somewhat limited by the actual organic beings in the universe that they're invading. Both of these species are incredibly dangerous. They're basically endgame villains for 40k and Halo. They're both also mindless, hive mind-esque consumers of matter. I think the Flood infection gets more noticeably dangerous as it gets larger, not only through increased numbers or genetic diversity as we have with the Tyranids, but also exponential increases in intelligence. I think if the Flood had managed to consume all biomass within a single galaxy, that they'd basically be trans-dimensional beings. A single key mind is said to rival Forerunner AI. What could an entire galaxy's worth of matter do? But as always, that is just my opinion. You guys have wanted this video for quite some time, so make sure you give it a thumbs up if you got to this point. Also, let me know what you thought of my analysis, if you agreed, disagreed, and any future videos you'd like to see on the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, this has been EckhartsLadder. May the Force be with you.